everyone, and welcome. So nice to see so many familiar faces and names. I know there will be people who will be coming in momentarily, but I'm really excited today to talk about a topic that I care a lot about and I'm learning a lot about from one of the experts in the field. And before we do that, I just want to welcome everybody and reintroduce myself. I'm Lisa Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence. I'm here with my colleague, Michelle Hancock. And this is the second in our monthly learning series. We have gotten a lot of requests to talk about topics that are important for mentors to dive into that may not necessarily be part of usual mentoring training or part of the dialogue, but really are skills and behaviors and concepts that are integral. And I'm so excited today to talk about psychological safety. I have been using our guest's book for some time now. He's a fellow Barrett Kohler author, and always his model gets lots of nods and ahas and even further questions, many of which I haven't been able to answer. So I'm hoping today that he can help us do that. So let me introduce Dr. Timothy Clark. Tim Clark is founder and CEO of LeaderFactor, which is a global consulting, training, and assessment organization that focuses on leadership, culture, and change. Dr. Clark is an international authority in the fields of psychological safety and innovation, large-scale change and transformation, and senior leadership development. He's worked personally with more than 200 executive teams around the world. He's the author of 5 books, including the book that I referenced, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, Defining the Path to Inclusion and Innovation. And he's also written more than 200 articles in publications like HBR, the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and Fast Company. He earned his PhD in social science from Oxford University and was a British and a Fulbright scholar. He's earned a master's degree in government and economics from the University of Utah. And as an undergrad at BYU, Brigham Young University, he was named first team academic All-American football player, where he completed a triple degree cum laude. Before he founded LeaderFactor 15 years ago, he was CEO of 2 companies. Tim, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So one of the reasons I was so excited to talk about psychological safety today is that, I talk a lot about building trust in mentoring relationships. And I get a lot of questions about what is psychological safety and how does it relate to trust? So I'm hoping you can start us off with that.
First of all, let's talk about trust. Trust is a larger, broader, bigger concept. So trust means that trust is about the reliability or predictability in another person related to competence, character, the truth, skill, all of those things. So I can rely on you. I can predict your performance and your behavior based on a track record. So it's this larger concept of reliability. Psychological safety is a subset of that. And it relates to my ability to rely on you and have faith in you based on our interaction. What it specifically means is that I can rely on the fact that you will reward my vulnerability. That's so psychological safety refers to a culture of rewarded vulnerability. So within this broad concept of trust, as I said, it relates to our interpersonal relationship. So that's a way to understand it in context with a view towards trust.
And how did you come to focus on psychological safety?
Let's see. Well, I'm trained as an organizational anthropologist. So I focus on culture and have done for 30 years. But psychological safety is a construct that we study within the field of culture. And let's just go back. I'll take you back in time a little bit. So really the first serious citation of psychological safety came in 1954 with the noted psychologist Carl Rogers in an article that he wrote called Toward a Theory of Creativity. And it was just a slow development of this concept. And I've followed the research literature, and I read everything from the beginning, and I started to realize that, well, first of all, culture is a very difficult topic. It's like squeezing Jello. It's hard to measure. It's hard to get your arms around. But I could see that psychological safety offered a key, and that it was something that anchored any kind of healthy, vibrant, strong, flourishing culture. And so I asked myself a question based on the research. The research had not yet helped us understand how it grows, because obviously having psychological safety, it's not binary.
Right.
It's a matter of degree. It could be high, it could be low, it could be somewhere in the middle. So how does it grow? Is there a pattern to the way it grows? That was my question. That was the research question that drove me. And after several years of research in this area, we could identify a pattern where it moved through these 4 successive stages. So I got involved in it early. And to me, it is the key to having a healthy and a strong and a productive culture in any social collective. It doesn't matter what it is. Now, here we're talking specifically about the mentor-mentee relationship, right? So just think about that in context. If you don't have psychological safety, you're going to have a hard time being successful.
Yeah. It's interesting. What strikes me as a question based on the many things that you've said so far is do we have a sort of a chicken and an egg scenario with, psychological safety is an indicia of vulnerability, and is vulnerability then required for psychological safety? I mean, where do you start in that cycle in order to make this happen?
Well, there's a central mechanism related to vulnerability, as you say, Lisa. There's 2 parts. Number 1, you have to model it. Number 2, you have to reward it. If you're the mentor, I would suggest that you have a first mover obligation. You're responsible to set the tone and the terms of engagement. So you have to go first.
Yeah.
You have to go first. Now, that may sound a little counterintuitive or a little ironic because you're the mentor, but you have to establish those terms of engagement, and you do it by modeling behavior, by modeling vulnerability yourself.
Yeah. And what does that look like? Is that sharing stories? Is that opening up for challenges? What does it look like to model that?
It can take many forms. One thing we have to acknowledge is that and you acknowledge this, there's a power differential usually in a mentor-mentee relationship.
Yeah.
And so as the mentor, part of your job is to create what I call cultural flatness. That means you need to neutralize the authority bias that might exist in that relationship. Authority bias is where we overvalue opinions at the top of a hierarchy, and we undervalue opinions at the bottom. That becomes a problem because over time we develop what we might call exaggerated deference, right? And that's not going to help. So if the mentor is responsible to create that cultural flatness, that means we become more agnostic to the power difference that exists. And we're not too worried about that. What we're worried about is helping and creating value and nurturing the growth and the development of the person, I think.
Yeah. A question on that, Tim, which is, we've been working more and more, and I'm looking at the attendees today who are watching this live, and it looks like it's mostly a North American audience, probably due to the fact that it's the middle of the day. here in North America. But, oftentimes we deal with mentoring pairs or even organizations that have offices, locations, employees in cultures that have really a high power distance by nature. So you've got this high power distance culture. You've got this mentor-mentee relationship where, as you say, you're striving for cultural flatness. How does one overcome the influence of culture of origin when, or I shouldn't say overcome it because that makes it sound like it's something too negative, but how does one overcome power differential in a high power distance culture?
As the mentor or the mentee?
Yes, both as the mentor and the mentee.
Right. So if you're the mentor, it's easy.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're higher in the hierarchy. And so if you simply model and reward vulnerability, you're going to get there very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, I was talking to leaders at the National Health Service in the UK.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic, they would throw clinical teams together at a moment's notice. They had to. They were just overburdened in hospitals. And so they'd put doctors and nurses and other clinicians together who didn't know each other, who had never worked a day together. So they had no relationship. In some cases, those teams operated with incredibly high psychological safety on day one.
Mm.
How did they do that? They did that because the leader modeled and rewarded vulnerability immediately and was explicit about the terms of engagement. So it can happen very quickly. Humans, when we come together in social situations, culture formation begins instantaneously as soon as we begin to interact. And so those norms that we develop, they develop immediately. And so back to your question, Lisa, the mentor can make that happen very quickly. For the mentee, it's harder.
Mm-hmm.
The mentee is on the other end of that power distance. One suggestion that I would have is to try to coach the mentor through a model of inquiry, through questions. It's often true that someone higher in the hierarchy will allow you to go through a process of joint discovery with them as you explore questions together.
Mm-hmm. That
tends to help happen. It can help. Give an example, and I talked about this example in the book a little bit. Years ago, I ran a consulting firm based in Boston. My boss was based in Tokyo. We were owned by a Japanese parent company. So my boss was a Japanese gentleman based in Tokyo. And when I was first put into this position, I was scared to death that I was going to get fired because I had read cultural accounts that talked about the hierarchical nature of the culture and about engaging in constructive dissent, and that was not such a good thing.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, I'm going to get fired because I don't know how else to do my job. I need to be able to give input and feedback and analysis. Turns out my boss was incredible in creating that environment of psychological safety and rewarded vulnerability where I could challenge the status quo and that behavior would be consistently rewarded. So that was a great blessing to me. If you have someone that comes from a very hierarchical background and is deeply socialized in that way, it's going to be a gradual process, right? It's going to be harder.
Yeah, takes time. Andrea asked a question in the chat. She says, cultural competency must play a role. The behaviors for what it looks like to be vulnerable can and do differ in parts of the world. So thoughts on that?
Yes. So I guess the best way, here's what comes to mind. So one of the organizations that we work with is the World Bank. And a senior leader at the World Bank came to me not long ago and said, Tim, okay, so help me understand. We have operations in 160 nations.
Yeah.
What are the implications then? Does this mean that I need to learn the cultures of all of these nations so that I can be effective? How would you answer that question? It's not even viable. There's no way. So what do? Psychological safety provides the answer. Psychological safety provides a global platform for human interaction. Psychological safety is a function of respect on the one hand and permission on the other. It lives at the intersection of these two dimensions. So when we use those as terms of engagement, then psychological safety becomes that global platform for interactions. Now, are we going to be unaware of cultural customs and nuances and traditions? Yes, we will. And we can't possibly learn all of those throughout the world. And will we make some mistakes along the way? Yes, we will. But we have the basis for a productive relationship and a way to collaborate and work with each other. That's what psychological safety provides.
So powerful, this intersection of respect and permission. And I want to come back to this idea of how you kind of create and be explicit about those permissions in a minute. But first, I want to go back to your model, Tim, because before I read your book, I was under the very naive impression that psychological safety was binary. You either had it or you didn't have it. And incredible model and help us understand why and how.
Sure. Let me run through the stages quickly. So here's the first research question that I asked myself. When employees, so I'm thinking about this in an organizational context, all right? When employees come together to meet, it could be face-to-face, it could be virtual, it could be hybrid, doesn't matter what the configuration is. What do they want to accomplish in the room, so to speak? And so I identified 4 objectives that human beings have. Number 1, they want connection. They want to be included. That's one of the things that they want to accomplish. Second, they want to learn. They want to grow. They want to develop. Third, they want to contribute. They want to make a difference. And fourth, they want to change and improve things. So the second question that I asked was, is there a sequence to this? Is it random? And out of that research came the identification of the 4 stages of psychological safety, which is a universal pattern. And it lays out the sequence in which human beings try to satisfy those basic human needs. So once the material needs are met, we move on to non-material needs. That's what psychological safety is all about. It's how and in what sequence humans attempt to satisfy their non-material psychological needs. So stage 1 is inclusion safety. And that means that you feel safe to be yourself. It's not expensive to be your authentic self. And you feel a sense of inclusion, acceptance, and a sense of belonging. That's stage one. And it's first in sequence because in the research, it's very clear that human beings seek to satisfy that need first. Then we go to stage two, which is learner safety, which means that you feel safe to engage in the learning process without fear of being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. That means that you can engage in acts of learning vulnerability, such as, well, I can ask a question. I can say, I don't know. I can make a mistake. I can try something new. I can ask for feedback. There's a subset of vulnerable behaviors that pertain specifically to learning. You'll be rewarded for those. That's stage two, learner safety. Then we go to stage three, which is contributor safety. You feel safe and are given the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution, to do work that matters. And you're given an appropriate level of autonomy to do that, as well as role clarity. That's stage three. And that satisfies a very basic human need to contribute, gain some control, have some autonomy and contribution. And then finally, we go to stage four, the culminating stage, which is challenger safety. Challenger safety means that you feel safe to challenge the status quo, again, without fear of negative consequences. And as you can imagine, when we're thinking about challenging the status quo, it gets a little scary. It's pretty frightening for most people because the stakes are high and the margin of error is low. You're thinking about your reputation. You're thinking about career growth. You're thinking about upward mobility potential. You're thinking about your job. But you can do that. So stage four means you can challenge the status quo and you'll be rewarded for that behavior. And by the way, stage four, challenger safety, is where we innovate. That's where most of the innovation takes place because innovation requires deviation. It requires that we disrupt and challenge the status quo. So that's a brief outline of the stages and the progression through them.
Yeah. You've talked a little bit about how I create psychological safety, but how do I know if I've done it successfully or not?
I think the way that you know, Lisa, is you watch the patterns of those around you and you watch if they are willing to engage in certain acts of vulnerability. That's the evidence. Because we all humans, when humans move into social situations, we engage in threat detection. And we have to run a risk reward calculation in our heads. And the question we ask ourselves is, am I in a safe or an unsafe environment? If I engage in this act of vulnerability, will I be rewarded or punished? So back to your question, if you see evidence around you that people are consistently engaging in acts of vulnerability, that is evidence that they believe that they will be rewarded for that behavior.
Yeah. How would I ask a mentee if I've created it? I mean, if I'm doing a check-in, one of the things that I hammer on to mentors and mentees is to create this regular and ongoing feedback. What is a question that I might ask my mentee to be able to gauge this better, and measure myself against my own standards to create learner safety or psychological safety?
I think in a mentor-mentee relationship, let's go back to the work of Carl Rogers, who coined the phrase unconditional positive regard, which was a precursor to psychological safety. And so one question, and this is a tough question, but it's one that I would ask is, what do you feel that our tolerance for candor is
Mm.
in our discussion? And do you feel, so that's one question. A related question would be, do you feel that you can engage in creative abrasion and constructive dissent with me? Do you feel that you have a license to disagree and you can use it with me? Those are some examples.
Yeah, those are fantastic examples. I want to drill down a little bit on learner safety. As I'd mentioned, purpose and the process and the product of a mentoring relationship. And one of the things I love the most about your model is that the precursor to learning is belonging through inclusion safety. But I'm wondering how, what thoughts you have about the role of psychological safety in creating a learning environment, and what mentors and mentees can do to really drill down and make sure that they're safe to learn.
Sure. I would begin with this premise, Lisa, which is that the learning process is both intellectual and emotional.
Mm.
So in the learning process, we cannot separate the thinking brain from the feeling brain. It's not possible. So if I am consistently punished in the learning process, if I'm experiencing punished vulnerability, ultimately I will become cognitively impaired because that's the emotional process I'm going through. And my thinking brain is connected to my feeling brain. And so we have to create a learning environment that is very emotionally nurturing and rewarding to the individual. I'll give you an example. I cite this in the book. Every 26 seconds, a student drops out of high school in the United States.
Wow.
Well, if that weren't tragedy enough, here's the greater tragedy. When we do the research, the vast majority of these students have the ability to do the academic work. They have the cognitive horsepower. Why are they dropping out? Well, you got to go upstream. They're dropping out because they don't have the support. They don't have the encouragement. Slowly, they fall behind. After they fall behind, they lose hope and they lose confidence, and then they call it quits. So in a mentor-mentee relationship, I would emphasize the fact that learning is intellectual and emotional. We're trying to emotionally empower the individual, and then they become cognitively enabled, right? We have an entire mountain of empirical research with children and adolescents and adults that tells us that this is true. And so then furthermore, I guess the last thing that I would say in answer to your question, Lisa, is that if you're in a mentor-mentee relationship, if you're mentoring, don't assume that your mentee comes to you, arrives ready to learn. That often is a heroic assumption. Often they have come out of trauma. They have come out of a toxic environment where vulnerability was punished, and learning vulnerability was certainly punished. And therefore, you need to nurture the conditions of learner safety. And it's going to take a little time before you can draw them out, and they will jump, they'll eagerly engage with you.
One of the things that you talk about in your book when you talk about learner safety is that, it's incumbent upon somebody to create the in this case, we'll call it the mentor, to create safe fail. I love the quote by, am I frozen, Michelle? Can you hear me? Okay,
You're okay.
Super.
Yeah.
There's a quote by Sarah Blakely, who's the founder of Spanx, or a story that she tells, that when she was growing up, that her father asked her every day at the dinner table, how did you fail today? And I thought and she credits that really as being so fundamental to her success as an entrepreneur, in building her, lowercase e empire. And it really strikes me as such an important question in mentoring. And to your point about kind of having patience with the learning process, even drawing that out of a mentee can be really, really difficult because they've been taught for so long. We've all been taught for so long that failure is a bad thing. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that and how you see this embracing of failure as critical in the learning environment.
In many organizations and in many settings, Lisa, we have a prevailing norm that attaches fear to failure. If you're in an environment that is high with stage 2 learner safety, you disconnect fear from failure. You disconnect them because they are not necessarily connected, right? And so, for example, and in the book, I talk about this case study of this high school calculus teacher that I studied. I did room observations. I interviewed his students. I observed him, and he created the prevailing norm in his classroom where he would disconnect mistakes from fear. And it took a little while to establish the new norm, but he was able to do it. And so here's what he replaced it with. He would tell the students, he would say, mistakes are not the exception. Mistakes are the expectation. Do you understand? They're not the exception. It would take them a little while, but once they adopted the new norm, Lisa, they would jump in without the normal fear and inhibition that surrounds learning, because learning is fraught with risk. We all bring some level of fear and trepidation and inhibition to the learning process. If we can disconnect mistakes and errors from fear, now we have gone to a new place, and now we can accelerate learning, and we can get to what organizations call learning agility. Learning agility means that you're able to learn at or above the speed of change. And that's the imperative in most organizations. Okay, but as a practical matter, how are you going to do that? Without stage 2 learner safety, it probably won't happen. But with stage 2 learner safety, there's a good chance that you could get there.
Super powerful. So if I wanted to ask a cheeky question, I would ask you, how long does it take? And I know the answer is not 2 hours and 45 minutes to create. There's not a set time, but how should we be thinking about the pace of the creation of psychological safety?
It's a wonderful question. So we now house the world's largest normative database for psychological safety based on the 4 stages. We use a psychometric scale to measure it at the team level. And so if we get a baseline at T1, right, time 1, and then we have an intervention and we work hard, how long does it take to make significant measurable gains? We are seeing evidence of 3 months right now, where a team can significantly reshape their prevailing norms in as few as 3 months. Now they have to keep doing that, right? They have to consolidate those gains, but we're seeing evidence of significant improvement in as few as 3 months.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Yeah,
that's
it's amazing.
Remarkable. And I imagine, I mean, here, let me throw out my own hypotheses of seeing something from the different lens of mentoring, which tends to be more relational on a one-on-one basis. When people ask me, why I'm so passionate about mentoring, it's because each of the mentoring relationships, when they're done effectively, begin to change the culture. They begin to change team cultures. They begin to change organizational cultures. And I'm wondering if the same is true. You see the same in terms of psychological safety. If it happens kind of one relationship at a time, it happens on a team basis. And then also, I know this is a compound question, Tim, but it's coming to me in my head as I'm saying it. How does psychological safety get reinforced at the organizational level?
Right. So I think that comes back to models of organizational change, Lisa.
Yeah.
And there are two primary models. The first is a top-down cascade.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's the best of all worlds. That's the ideal, where the leader and the senior leadership team, they become committed to cultural transformation, and they're willing to model and reward vulnerability. If that happens, then they're going to create a juggernaut, and they're going to create tremendous energy and momentum, and that entire process will be accelerated. So that's ideal. But if you can't have that, then the other model of change is what we would call a beachhead model, which is that you establish a beachhead somewhere in the organization, you penetrate, and then you radiate, right? You land and then you expand. And so that goes to what you're saying. You can do that anywhere. And so what happens is that you have a team, and the team becomes kind of an enclave, a sanctuary of psychological safety within the organization. And then it begins to expand from there, because the norms are contagious, they're powerful, they spread, and it becomes scalable. But of course, that assumes that other people are willing to model and reward vulnerability. I always come back to that mechanism, because there's no shortcut to it, right? There's no workaround, there's no back door to modeling and rewarding vulnerability. Everything else is scaffolding. It's just support to that. But those are the two patterns by which it can spread.
Super helpful. Okay, Wendy's asking a great question in the chat. I just want to read it out loud for those who don't see. What would you say to a person, boss, mentor, or company who tells you this is a psychologically safe place? Isn't that my or the participant's decision?
Yeah. No, it's a humorous question, because I can't tell you how many executives I've seen the last 2 years that they brought all their employees together. They've held an all hands meeting, and they said, by golly, we're going to have a speak up culture, and it begins right now. Excuse me? As if you could decree it into existence with mere words.
Yeah. Yeah.
So any leader that says that is either culturally tone deaf or doesn't really care, because that's not how it works. So let me just mention a couple of principles here, governing principles. Number one, leaders are ultimately responsible for conditions by virtue of positional power. They are responsible for conditions, but who gets to say whether those conditions obtain and whether we have psychological safety or not? You do. You're the boss. You're the one that does the risk reward calculation and says, we have enough psychological safety that I'm going to engage in this vulnerable behavior or not. You're the boss. And no one can ever take that away from you. You get to determine, because it's based on your perception, your observation, the conditions, right? That's something that you determine.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question, and I want to just ask the person who asked it. I don't know your first name, but it's C. Shadan has said, how do you deal with inherent bias? So Tim, I don't know if you have an answer to that question as it's written, or if you need more context, but I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Well, normally the distinction that we make when it comes to bias is that we have conscious or unconscious bias. We have unconscious means it's hidden, right? And that means that we don't know that we have it. What we have found is that the more psychological safety you can nurture in an environment, the more that your powers of observation go to the next level. And as you do that, as you pay more attention to that, and as you're working on your own ability to model and reward vulnerability, what happens is that very gradually, both through self-awareness and through feedback, the unconscious becomes conscious. Now, it's a very gradual process, right? But over time, this happens if you're in an environment of psychological safety. Why? Because an environment of psychological safety is an environment where there's a high tolerance for candor. If people really believe it's not expensive to be themselves, then they're going to be themselves. And they're also going to give feedback. They're going to give more unsolicited feedback than ever before. And so what happens as a result of all of this is that the team or the organization begins to circulate feedback and local knowledge to an order of magnitude that you never did before. Well, what does that do for you? It means that you're looking into a clean mirror. And when you look into a clean mirror day after day, you have a choice. You either change, right? Because you got to grow and develop, or you either change or you just justify your behavior. So what I'm saying is that environment is ideal to bring your unconscious bias to the surface, make it visible, make it conscious, and then you can remove that bias. So I hope that makes sense. So psychological safety becomes that enabling condition to move the unconscious to conscious.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to piggyback on that a little bit, Tim, to share an kind of anecdotally, an experience that I've heard in several mentoring relationships is that when psychological safety is present, the mentee feels comfortable reflecting the bias back to the mentor because the mentor doesn't feel threatened by that feedback. They've opened up the environment with ongoing feedback. And, I had a mentee report to me that they, we often will interview mentees, 3 months, 6 months into the process, where they had a really difficult conversation, a hard time getting off the ground with their mentor. And through some coaching and really demonstrating a lot of the behaviors that you're saying, psychological safety began to really grow in the relationship. And the mentee was so proud of himself because he was able to say to the mentor, I actually think you might be looking at this from a really biased viewpoint. And, in my experience, such and such and such and such. And it was a great area of growth that I don't think could have happened if they hadn't really worked on creating some safety in that relationship.
I couldn't agree more, Lisa. That's such a beautiful case study. That relates to the follow-up comment in the chat, right? Mentors seem threatened by this type of openness. Yes, sometimes they are, but see, that's the whole point. So let's go to stage 4, challenger safety. Challenger safety means that you feel safe to challenge the status quo. Now, this is where the mentor's behavior becomes so crucial. If I react negatively or emotionally in some way to feedback, then what happens? I'm shutting it down, because here's a governing principle. Fear breaks the feedback loop. It always breaks the feedback loop. So if you operate by fear, if you push the fear button, you just need to know, whoever you are, that you're breaking the feedback loop. Is that what you want to do? Your response, particularly your negative emotional response to feedback, bad news, candor, whatever it is, will reverberate And people, because we're adaptable creatures. So if I'm getting if I'm getting a negative response, then I'm going to recoil. I'm going to retreat. I'm going to withdraw. You have thrust me into a defensive mode of performance. I am now managing personal risk. It's about self-preservation. It's about loss avoidance. So I say to all the leaders out there, is that what you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
Do you really want to push the fear button? Because you need to understand that if you push the fear button, you not only break the feedback loop, but there are first and second and third order consequences. And eventually you're going to sit down to a banquet of those consequences. Are you ready for that? Because you need to understand what you're doing here. Now, that's a little bit sobering when you put it that way.
But powerful and
but
important.
that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yasko, really, you finished the comment with, so how does the mentee deal with that resistance? And I think it is through feedback. And it is, we'll talk in a minute, Tim. I want to ask you about agreements that mentors and mentees can make to really set the stage for psychological safety. If you've taken the time at the beginning of the mentoring relationship to set agreements with one another, then one way the mentee can deal with this resistance is going back to those agreements that you've set at the beginning and saying, I call it the behavior of naming the dynamic. It might say something like, if Tim and I were in a mentoring relationship and I felt like Tim was threatened by my openness, I might say something like, Tim, I'm noticing you sitting back in your chair, or I'm noticing you shutting down a little bit. Can we just talk about that? We agreed to have ongoing feedback. Can we talk about how that relates to, I'm not articulating it well, but you understand the question. And then we can, as the mentee, I can begin to exercise some of that power of the co-creation of the relationship in breeding psychological safety. So it's an excellent question. So thank you so much for asking it. And let me catapult that, Tim, into the question that you and I had batted around a little bit before this, which is, what can mentors and mentees do early on in the relationship to set the stage for creating psychological safety?
Well, I think I don't have a better response than what you just said, Lisa, and that is to be explicit in agreeing to your agreements, your terms of engagement, your ground rules, whatever you want to call them, so that the expectations are clear and shared. I can't, it's the best thing it's the best way to go. Right. So now, you have rules of the road. You can now navigate. The expectations are clear and they are shared. And if there's a violation, you both know it and you can repair it more quickly. So I think that's what you have to do. But I think we have to be more explicit up front than perhaps we were in the past.
And it requires humility too, right? I mean, mentors in particular who come into mentoring relationships, maybe not having experience in formal mentoring, or, being often, they're very senior leaders in the organization who are great leaders, but they're not necessarily great mentors. And having the humility that there may be something to learn is really, really important in creating that stage for vulnerability, right? Saying, I don't have all the answers for you. I want to learn from you, mentee, as much as you want to learn from me. And Kunor just echoes that. She says, yes, humility in all caps. Part of the ability to repair requires accepting the other person's experience as truth, not something to be disputed. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point, Kunor. Thank you. I want to invite, we have just a few minutes left. Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Tim?
I do want to make one observation. The best mentors that I've ever been around are people who have reached what I might call the final stage of confidence, which means that they've lost the preoccupation with self. They're not concerned about impressing you. They are concerned about blessing you. It's very different. They've graduated, and it's a blessed day when that happens. But you can see that in a mentor, because sometimes mentors, they haven't graduated yet to that final stage of confidence. They want to hear themselves talk. And so in the mentor-mentee relationship, they're still taking most of the airtime. They're still not mentoring through questions rather than answers through an inquiry process. They're just talking too much. They're not listening. And it's all reflective of their psychological state. They're not there yet. But you can tell when someone's there, the humility comes into play. They've let go of their ego defense mechanisms, their pride of authorship, and they're truly there, focused on the needs and the interests of the individual, and they're really tuned in. They are listening with the intent to comprehend. You can tell.
It's a demonstration of curiosity, right? And Kuhner just called it confident humility. I love that, Kuhner, as a phrase as well. But this idea of like demonstrating curiosity, that you're not the sage on the stage. You don't have to tell it all. You really can be the guide on the side and help do that learning. I love that. And Amanda says that the best mentor she ever had was like that. So is the one you have now. Lucky lady. That's fantastic. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. If there's any questions, I want to invite you to put them in the chat. Michelle, I just would love to have you just share ways to get in touch with Dr. Clark and his work at LeaderFactor. I can't recommend the book, The 4 Stages of Psychology, highly enough. Am I saying that correctly? I hope I'm not double negativing myself, but it is without reservation the book that has taught me the most to help teach mentors and mentees on how to build this environment of trust. So we also have great recommendation book already. Great conversation, Tim. Book is already ordered, says Janelle. That's great. Tim, thank you. Oh, let's see. There might be one more question. I want to make sure to get that. Can those links be added to the chat? Sure, we can do that, Amanda. If you hang on 1 second, we'll go ahead and do that as well. I want to thank you so much. It's a joy to get to talk to you. I have, as I mentioned, been long a fan of your work and appreciate the wisdom that you have shared with everybody today. We are recording this and we'll share the recording with everybody who registered. I know I'll be watching it again. I couldn't take notes quickly enough as we were in this conversation to really capture all of these gems. Thank you for the generosity of your time and your wisdom, and for the good work that you've done on this really important topic.
Well, thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
I hope that everybody will join us for the next in our series, which is about the role of authenticity in mentoring. We're going to be talking with Carice Anderson, who's an expert in this topic, on April 25th. The link is on the screen on how to register, and we'll be sending that out as well. And Michelle has added all the links to the chat. Thank you, Michelle, for doing that. Again, Tim, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, everybody, for dialing in.